When it comes to motherboards, there's certain form factors and other standards that manufacturers have to adhere to, like the well-known AT and ATX standards, for example. But that really only defines certain motherboard characteristics like dimensions and some electrical standards. Still lots of room for manufacturers to get, well, creative, shall we say. You'll find that most try to stick with certain best practices though, like making sure expansion slots aren't obstructed, keeping power and front panel connectors in the same general areas. You know, very logical things like that. But today, I'm going to take a look at a 386 board that completely flies in the face of best practices. I'd like to introduce you to the cursed 386, aka the Atronics ATI-386 B2. And as you can see, Atronics decided to take advantage of the copious amount of unclaimed PCB space between each ISA slot on the board. That's right, there's about 11 millimeters of precious real estate between each slot, just enough to squeeze a 30-pin RAM slot in between each of them. I'm sorry, I laugh every time I see this because somebody actually thought this layout was a good idea. Good enough to get beyond the brainstorming and design phase and to actually mass produce this board. But is my initial reaction to this, bizarre layout misplaced? Were there some good reasons for this unconventional setup? I'm going to dig in, take a closer look, and obviously I've got to get this thing working and give it a try for myself. But before I do that, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out and big thank you to ThisOldTech. He donated this board to the channel along with a number of other cool items, including a bunch of new old stock accessories and a 3DFX Voodoo 3 PCI card, which will hopefully make an appearance in a future repair video. ThisOldTech is a major contributor to the Retro Web project, a project that's near and dear to my heart, and you'll see lots of photos and BIOS dumps of boards that he's rescued there. He's always working to save vintage parts from the hands of scrappers, and he's got an eBay store as well, which I'll link in the description below. So this is the ATI-386 B2. ATI is short for Atronics International, by the way, no affiliation with the graphics company. It's a 386DX motherboard released in or around 1990 or 91, based on the date codes I'm seeing. It's based on the SiS Rabbit chipset, which is made up of 3 separate ICs, as well as a discrete IPC or integrated peripheral controller. The chipset's made up of the 85C 310, 320, and 330. The 310 is the memory and cache controller. The 320 handles the AT bus interfacing, bus dividers, keyboard clock, things like that. And the 330 handles the buffering and interfacing between the CPU and the chipset. Now, interestingly, the 330 also has a very small amount of cache memory on it, 128 bytes. That's right, bytes, not kilobytes. Really not very much. But according to the datasheet, this can be enabled if there's no external L2 cache installed on the board, and apparently it can help with performance a little bit. The large socketed IC up near the top of the board is the IPC. In this case, it's the SiS 85C206, and it provides a whole bunch of very important functions, including DMA controllers, interrupt controllers, real-time clock, and some other things. But I have seen photos of this board with other brands of IPC in the socket here too, so it's a pretty standard part, I think. But yeah, as you can see, things weren't as integrated in those days, and you had ICs all over the board, each with a different part to play. And that meant lots of traces, passive components, buffers or bus transceivers, and so on. And when you're dealing with baby AT form factor boards like this one, it's not surprising that manufacturers tried some different things to make the most of the PCB real estate. Sometimes that meant sacrificing some features too. For example, here's a Micronics board that I have from roughly around the same era. It's got only 4 RAM slots on it, which is just a single bank and very unusual for a 386 platform because it really limits its flexibility. But rather than using the space between the ISA slots, no idea why, Micronics released this monstrosity to go vertical instead, the M710 memory expansion board, which adds an additional 3 banks, and it obstructs just a single ISA slot to do it. But although the Atronics board's memory layout is clearly cursed, at least it's got 8 slots and 2 banks. Pretty standard for a 386, and doesn't require any special expansion card or anything like that. Taking a closer look at the slots themselves, looks like these are the cheap plastic variety, unfortunately. The same type you'll find on AW32 Sound Blaster cards, and they do get brittle with age and have a tendency to break, so I'll have to be very careful with them. Thankfully, 30-pin SIMs come in a variety of heights. I've got 3 different sets here as an example. These 9-chip SIMs are relatively tall and definitely could be a problem. But 3-chip SIMs are quite a bit shorter since the chips on them are typically mounted horizontally. This set here is especially low profile, and as you can see, they're actually shorter than the ISA slots and shouldn't interfere with anything. The only problem is, being so short, It's a royal pain to get them pressed into the slots at the correct angle. The ISA slot next to it just makes it really difficult and blocks your fingers from getting a good grip on them. I think it's pretty clear that the designers of this board had low-profile SIMs like this in mind, but there's obviously nothing stopping someone from using taller ones. The 9-chip variety can be a serious obstruction, and in this case, my multi-IO card can't even be inserted fully because the floppy connector just hits the top of the SIM. And if you have both banks populated on the board, it's not like you can just move the card to another slot. It'll literally be obstructed in all of them. The VBIOS chips on my ATI Mach 32 also just barely clear the SIM, but I'm sure I could easily find other cards in my parts bin that would be a problem with this setup. But even if you did use low-profile SIMs, there's obviously the issue of accessibility. In those days, it wasn't uncommon to have most of the ISA slots occupied, and if you needed to replace or upgrade your RAM, pretty much guarantees you'd have to remove all of your expansion cards. Another interesting feature related to memory is this slot here at the bottom right-hand corner of the board. Just like on the Micronics board I showed earlier, it is a memory bus expansion slot. But unfortunately, there was never any kind of standard for this, and my Micronics card doesn't fit. But with 8 slots on the board, really wouldn't have been all that important to most people. I was actually speaking with ThisOldTech after I started looking at the board, and he discovered that there were actually multiple revisions of the ATI-386 B2. The quote-unquote cursed model I have here is revision B01, and not surprisingly, the newer C00 revision completely does away with the bizarre memory layout. The 8 slots do look pretty squeezed at the top of the C revision, but just by moving the keyboard controller and battery and shifting the power connector by 90 degrees, they were able to make it happen. Moving on to the CPU, there's a standard PGA socket here for a 386DX, as well as one 4A math coprocessor next to it. The coprocessor socket actually has a whole extra row of pins. An i387 only has 2 rows, not 3, so I'm assuming it must be a dual-purpose socket that can also take certain Y-Tech chips. And I can see that the SiS Rabbit chipsets does support both, so that would certainly make sense. As with most boards of this era, there's no clock generator chip with adjustable bus frequencies. You've basically got a single crystal oscillator for that purpose. And this board's got a 66 megahertz crystal in it, which is divided by half, so perfect for this DX33 and matching Intel i387 math coprocessor that I'm going to use in this system. There's also 10 cache sockets here for SRAM, fully populated with 8K x 8 chips for a total of 64 kilobytes, which is pretty standard for a 386DX around this age. These 2 EEPROM chips here are where the AMI BIOS is stored. Like most older boards, there's an odd and an even chip, and the BIOS is split across both. The reason for this is that the older EEPROMs were 8-bit chips, and the 286, 386, and later platforms used a 16-bit data bus. There's also an unpopulated DIP socket here that's just labeled as 8-bit, so I'm assuming the board can probably work with single 8-bit EEPROMs too, which is kind of neat. And in the top left corner, we can see that this board was the victim of some battery leakage, unfortunately. ThisOldTech told me that the battery was already removed when it came into his possession, so that's good because it probably helped to minimize the damage over time. There is a small amount of corrosion to some of the traces here, but thankfully it really doesn't look all that bad. It's very localized and doesn't seem like anything's been eaten through completely. I am going to put some vinegar on this later to neutralize whatever electrolyte's left and to prevent it from corroding any further. Thankfully, this board does have an external battery header on it though, so no need to MacGyver anything in place, and I've got some AAA battery packs around that'll probably work just fine. Alright, so let's take a look at the other parts that we're going to use to round off this build here. As I showed earlier, I'm going to be using this ATI Mach 32 for graphics. Good performance in DOS and good picture quality too. And like most boards from the early 90s, there's no onboard I/O provided, so I'm going to use this Acer M5105 multi-I/O card, which provides floppy IDE and serial connectivity. For storage, I'm going to use a compact flash card. I've got an old Memorex 256 megabyte card that I hang on to for older builds like this, and I can guarantee you that this board will have some kind of a hard drive size limitation. I'm guessing it's probably a little over 500 megabytes, so 256 megs should be a good fit. And last but not least, we've got to have some kind of sound card installed here, so I'm going to use the Sound Blaster 1.5 clone made by David E. Larsson, and I reviewed this great clone a few months back, so be sure to check out the description for a link to that video. Sound Blaster 1.5 was released in 1990, I think, so a card like this should be perfect for a build of this age. Oh, and I should mention about the final memory setup I'm going to be using. I did swap around a lot of sticks there for testing. I went with all 8 sticks of the very low profile SIMs. Each one is 1 megabyte for a total of 8 megs of RAM. These sticks are rated for 70 nanoseconds, which is pretty standard and more than enough for a 33 megahertz bus speed. Admittedly, 8 megs is quite a lot for a 386. 4 megs may have been more period correct, but only seem right to get a board like this one fully populated. Alright, so I've got everything put together here, and you'll notice the board is actually just sitting on a cardboard box, not the usual motherboard tray that I use for testing. Some of the mounting holes on this board are quite off, actually. Most of the AT boards I have will fit just fine, maybe with just one hole off or something like that, but this one has several, so I just gave up and we'll do it the sketchy, yet still functional way. You can also see that I've got the AAA battery pack connected here, and I'll include a link in the description if you'd like to learn more about how I do these up. Okay, moment of truth. I always get a bit nervous when I'm powering up hardware that's over 30 years old. Really never know if a tantalum cap's going to explode or who knows what, but here we go. It's alive. Nice, I've got a flurry of activity on the post analyzer card. It does seem to be getting somewhere. The post is taking a very long time for some reason, so I'm just going to skip ahead here a bit. But as expected, all of the defaults are loaded because it didn't have a CMOS battery attached for a very long time. And here we are in the AMI BIOS, very sparse to say the least. I've set the date and time. I'm just setting the hard drive geometry for the compact flash card. Then we'll reboot and see if we can get into DOS. Okay, to make a long story short, I did get into DOS, but really not for very long. The system was just plain unstable, would hard lock, and sometimes it just wouldn't boot at all. But after 10 or 15 frustrating minutes, which I didn't bother recording by the way, I think I finally know what's going on here. I had always been skipping the memory test during post because, well, it takes forever. But instead, I let it run its course, and sure enough, it would sometimes fail after about 1.3 megabytes or so. So definitely wasn't happy about something RAM related, and that was a very useful hint. And that's when I discovered this. I struggled so much getting these sims inserted that I didn't even notice that one of the retaining clips had broken right off. Didn't I mention something about these being fragile earlier in the video? But yeah, this sim had some contact flakiness, that's for sure. If I held the stick upright with my finger, it would post just fine. But yeah, time to get creative myself. Here's a folded up post-it note that I've squeezed between the sim and the slot. You see, there is some good side benefits to having a sim slot so close to an ISA slot. So with that issue sorted, the system seems to be completely stable now. No more flakiness, but system seems super slow. As you can see here, it does not stack up well against what we'd expect from a 386 DX33. Thankfully, I have a pretty good idea what's going on here. For it to be this slow, it's got to be a turbo issue. On 486s, which I'm more familiar with, the turbo switch jumper is usually left in the open position for the system to run at full speed. When you short the jumper, it'll reduce the system speed. Now I've located the jumper and the turbo LED headers here on the edge of the board, and it is indeed in the open position. So I'm going to attach an LED here first, and if it doesn't light up, then we're in quote-unquote low performance mode. Yep, no light, so let's short the turbo switch header and see what happens. Bingo, lights on. Let's run system information CPU benchmark again and see if it's improved. Much better, 13 now instead of 3, so that's a 10-fold increase, but still lagging way behind where it should be. One thing I'd like to check is the L2 cache memory. There's 64 kilobytes on the board, but is it actually working? The cache check tool is a great way to find out, and yep, I see the same latency across the board, which tells me that there is no L2 cache. So the standard BIOS screen is very basic. As you can see, you can set the date and time, hard drive geometry, display type, things like that. But not much else really. There's nothing performance related here, and there's no additional menu items hidden away either. But there is what's called the XCMOS, which I assume is short for Extended CMOS. This is where you'll find all of the advanced chipset settings, and it actually looks not at all user-friendly, I would say. Even displays the individual register bits that'll be modified to enable or disable certain chipset features. Man, I've got to imagine this would have looked incredibly intimidating to your average end user back in 1990. But really, it's quite simple. You just use the arrow keys to navigate, and there is a legend below that tells you what bits to set for the various options. And sure enough, the L2 cache was disabled, and the other settings were not at all, shall we say, performance optimized. There's settings in here for wait states, page mode, shadowing, and more. Oh, and remember that tiny 128 bytes of cache that I was mentioning earlier? Well, that can be enabled here too. So I went ahead and enabled everything that would have had a positive performance benefit. The L2 cache was enabled and set to the correct size, which is 64 kilobytes. I enabled page mode for the RAM, I set the cache wait state to 0, and I enabled shadowing. The only setting that wouldn't work well was setting the RAM wait state to anything lower than 2. Apparently this is only supported on bus clocks at or below 25 MHz, so I just left it at the default. Anyway, let's see if that improves things. Yes indeed, 36.0, even a smidge above the reference DX system on the chart. Very nice. And as you can see, we've got some lower latency values all the way up to 64 kilobytes in cache check now. So the L2 cache appears to be enabled and working. Excellent. All right, I'm satisfied this system's working as it should be. I think it's time to try out some games from the early 90s and see how they do. I do think it's important to have the right expectations when you're dealing with 386s and older platforms. Not all DOS games are going to run well, especially the later 3D stuff. The big one that really changed things though was Doom, released by id Software in 1993. Really was the next generation of 3D gaming at the time, and even the fastest 386s just couldn't handle it. Really needed a 486 and a fast 486 at that, not to mention a good VLB graphics card too. But yeah, as you can see here, the game does run, but it's just super laggy and really not enjoyable at all. Shrinking the display window size does help a little bit, as does reducing the detail. But yeah, a system like this was just never meant to run a game like Doom. But even if we go back in time just a little bit, a 386 DX could handle quite a bit. Even earlier 3D titles like Wolfenstein 3D run just fine. Pretty smooth experience too, even with a full-size viewing window.
Mein Leben!
Next up is SimCity, released back in 1989. I'm running the slightly newer version called SimCity Classic because, unlike the original, it supports sound blasters. One interesting thing about this game that a lot of people don't realize is that it takes advantage of math coprocessors. If one was detected, FPU math could be done in hardware, and larger, more complex cities could potentially run more smoothly. Someone posted some stopwatch tests on vogons a few years back, and sure enough, at maximum speed, the game progressed about 50% quicker with a coprocessor installed. Very neat. There really weren't many games that could take advantage of one in the early 90s. The vast majority of platformers also work great on a 386 DX. Here's one that I had a lot of fun with back in the day. This is Halloween Harry, released in 1993. The name of the game was actually changed to Alien Carnage later on. Apparently they didn't want it to be associated with Halloween and become sort of seasonal. But one interesting thing about this game is that it does not use MIDI music, but rather mod music, something pretty new in PC gaming at the time. The audio quality is pretty rough though, so I'm assuming it uses a very low sampling rate to keep the CPU cycles down. But hey, flamethrowers and aliens, what's not to love? One of the most popular genres in the 386 era was the point-and-click adventure-style games that we all know and love. I played a ton of King's Quest and Space Quest back then, but today I wanted to showcase a lesser-known game called The Adventures of Willie Beamish that was released in 1991. It's a point-and-click, choose-your-own-adventure style game, and I very clearly remember playing this with a good friend of mine back in the day. We would take turns seeing how far we'd get before making some kind of catastrophic decision that would lead to Willie's demise. I don't think it's aged quite as well as some of the others, but still a fun game and a good trip down memory lane for me personally. Well, there you have it. There's no doubt that this memory layout is incredibly cursed. But overall, the Atronics ATI-386 B2 is a very capable 386 platform, if, you can look past that one minor detail. Let's just say it gives it some character, and we'll leave it at that. Big thanks again to ThisOldTech for sending me this board. Had a lot of fun getting this system up and running, and it was great to play some older games too. May do some more work on this board in a future video, so stay tuned for that. I'd like to get that broken RAM slot replaced, maybe do some testing with that 128-byte internal cache. And if I'm not mistaken, there may be a Mr. BIOS image available for this board too, so that would be pretty neat to check out. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. My patrons get perks like early access to my videos, exclusive content, and more. And as always, don't forget to check out the video description for useful links and additional information. Thanks again.